So, welcome to the Wilberforce Institute at the University of Hull. Today, we're going to be looking at understanding your obligations under the Modern Slavery Act. So, we're a world-leading research centre. We were founded in 2006, and we belong to the University of Hull. So, we have an interdisciplinary focus with staff from history, law, social sciences, and education. All our team have direct experience of dealing with forced labour, debt bondage, trafficking, and smuggling in supply chains. As I said earlier, I'm a practitioner. I'm not actually an academic, so I tend to spend a lot of my time in the field. Our risk assessment services were actually set up in advance of the legislation kicking in 2014 to address modern slavery with businesses. In terms of my own background, I'm the director here of Risk Assessment Services. I've worked at Anti-Slavery International in the UK and the Comité contre l'esclavage moderne in France, and Spain and Italy. I am a social auditor. Although I specialize in agriculture, I also have looked at logistics and facilities management and construction and international supply chain. I was a consultant on the UN Global Programme Against Trafficking and Smuggling of Human Beings originally, so I've done a lot of work with origin and destination countries. And I've also worked a lot with the Ethical Trading Initiative, which is a tripartite body of NGOs, trade unions, and companies working together to monitor and improve conditions in international supply chains. I've done a lot of work with UK retailers and international brands. So, why focus on modern slavery? Well, first of all, as a UK company, it might be a legal requirement for you to report on modern slavery. If you are achieving those £36 million, the likelihood is that you need to start writing a statement. Secondly, supply chains the world over are really heavily dependent on workers that are vulnerable, and they are vulnerable to labour exploitation. So it's about doing the right thing. Thirdly, as a company, you should be looking at how you can actively manage the risks in your supply chain so that you've got continuous supply. And I think we've all learned that the hard way after the COVID pandemic and the impact that that had on our supply chains internationally. And then finally, it's about avoiding reputational risks to your company. I mean, if modern slavery or labor exploitation is found in your organization or in your supply chains, the likelihood is that many of your customers will be tempted to actually walk away. The objectives for today are therefore to firstly help you understand what is meant by modern slavery and who's at risk. Secondly, we're going to be covering off the main elements of Section 54 of the Modern Slavery Act, which is also known as Transparency in Supply Chain Guidelines. Thirdly, we're going to look at how businesses are meeting these obligations and try to, have a little bit more best practice between us and share a bit of best practice. And then finally, cover off any questions that you might have. So, the International Labour Organization, which is the UN body that works on labour issues globally, estimates that there are over 40 million people in a situation of modern slavery. It's the second most profitable criminal industry after drugs and worth over $180 billion. Human trafficking and smuggling is the fastest growing criminal industry in the world. And we have seen firsthand here in the UK what a priority it has become for the UK government to try to address smuggling and trafficking issues across the channel. The estimated figures in the UK are 13,000, although many believe that this is just the tip of the iceberg. Of the 40 million that the ILO estimate are in a situation of modern slavery, almost 25 million are in forced labour. So they may be entering our supply chains in one way or another, and over 50 million are in forced marriage. Modern slavery disproportionately affects women and girls. Over 71% are women and girls, and of these, 25% are children. So 1 in 4 victims of modern slavery are children. When it comes to forced labour, 50% of cases of modern slavery involve debt bondage. this is really the situation where an employee or a worker has borrowed money from the employer or has been given an advance for accommodation, food, etc., and ends up owing their employer more than they're able to earn. So they are in a continuous situation of owing that person more money than they're able to earn. And there's a situation of debt bondage. In terms of the risk, who is at risk and how? Well, it's mainly vulnerable, low-skilled workers, although here we have a picture of a lady working in the Malaysian electronics industry. They are very often migrant workers with poor language skills. However, in the UK, the cases that we have found of modern slavery, the majority have been British nationals. There may be subcontractors and agency workers, so they may be managed by an external labour agency. They may lack knowledge of their rights and how to enforce them, and almost always accept the situation as better than nothing. And they may be kept in control by exploiting individuals or gangs, and this is at the harsher end of the modern slavery spectrum. So we do find sometimes that, especially in cases where involving migrant workers, actual or threats of violence, and if it's not against the person themselves, it's against their family members in their origin countries. Then again, the threats might be about financial debt. They may have the passports withheld or their ID, and also they may have had their bank account cards confiscated and they're being used by the gangs. So some of you may have come across situations of modern slavery before and not actually been able to recognize it, or you may have come across them and not actually known what you were going to be able to do about it. But with the Modern Slavery Act in the UK, there is finally have a mandate to actually act on it. So the legal definition in the UK of modern slavery is domestic servitude, forced or compulsory labor, and human trafficking for the purpose of exploitation. The big difference between smuggling and trafficking is that smuggling is about, passage of a person from a point of A to B. Trafficking is passage of that person from A to B, but then further exploitation of them further down the supply chain. The intent is there from the beginning to exploit that person. The Modern Slavery Act, actually, when it was first introduced, was really at the forefront of all European efforts to address exploitative labor practices and modern slavery. But there is new EU legislation, and we will be talking about this in our next session. The EU legislation actually goes a lot further than the Modern Slavery Act now. But the Modern Slavery Act introduces 2 new civil orders. The first one is to prevent modern slavery, and the second one is to make provision for the protection of modern slavery victims. And within the Act itself, Section 54 concerns transparency in supply chain. So, offers some guidelines about how companies and organizations with a turnover of 36 million and above should be meeting that modern slavery legislation. So at the moment, the only thing that the Act requires of businesses and organizations is that when they reach that turnover threshold, they make a public statement on what they're doing to address modern slavery in their direct operations and in their supply chains. And that statement needs to be signed by somebody at the board of directors at an organizational level. So it doesn't actually mandate what should go into those statements. However, the guidelines give us 7 broad areas in which companies should be reporting. The first one is on operations and supply chain. So all companies should be talking about what they're doing to address modern slavery risks in their direct operations. So you should be looking at agency workers, any subcontractors that you have in the company, anybody involved in construction or maintenance or catering on your premises. You should be really identifying who are your core and strategic suppliers based on volume and value, because this will also give you an idea of how much you're exposed to risk. And if you are exposed to risk, it will also give you some leverage when it comes to actually having conversations with those suppliers around labor exploitation and modern slavery. And then you should be looking at those risks and understanding what is actually happening with your products and your services, and potentially doing risk assessments or a desk review. Secondly, you should be mapping your supply chains for traceability. So you should be looking at labor exploitation and modern slavery in your supply chains. But it helps to have an idea of what your supply chain looks like. So here we have the supply chain for a car battery. So here we have the raw material mining right at the beginning. Then you've got the manufacturing process, battery cell manufacturing. Then the battery pack assembly, that's the third part of the process. Then the EV manufacturing part further down the line. Then we've got an EV sales and leadership dealership program. Then that goes into the EV services, and then finally into EV component recycling. So that's what a supply chain looks like. And when it comes to doing a desk review of your risks, you would need to look at each part of that supply chain. Secondly, the guidelines ask us, what policies do we have to manage risks? So for us personally, as a social auditor, a policy which is just a piece of paper and nobody is able to tell me how it's applied or who it's applied to, or how it's being enacted, if they're not able to explain it to me verbally, or if people don't know about the policy, it's useless. So policies are only useful if you've actually trained people to implement them and people know what they're supposed to be doing. So the type of policies that we're talking about are modern slavery policy, right to work verification and recruitment policies, how you employ your labor, how you find new staff, your living wage policies. So we have in the UK living wage legislation now, but for me, much more importantly is the 0-hour workers, and making sure that they're able to attain a living wage, so that they're working enough hours in the week so that they're able to pay for their accommodation and food and health and transport. There may also be policies around trade union representations, collective bargaining agreements that you've established, grievance policy. If somebody has a problem, how do you deal with it as a company? Who do people go to? How is it investigated? How is it communicated? We also have whistleblowing policies. So increasingly, you will hear companies talk about worker voice mechanisms. So this is really whistleblowing. It's about how workers are able to raise concerns internally and confidentially, because as you will understand, if it's a modern slavery issue, it's very sensitive, and people are very frightened to talk about these issues. So they don't want their name to be given to the managers or the supervisors. So it's about reporting these things confidentially and allowing people to report problems confidentially. We've also got contractual terms and conditions with, such as service license agreements with labor agencies, and then working hour policies, rest days, holiday days, overtime, agency worker regulations. Those kind of policies we would like to see in place. Thirdly, the guidelines suggest that you should be talking about your due diligence processes. So you might want to send somebody like me to do a risk assessment of a site of one of your suppliers if you think you've got an issue, or more simply, you might want to look at how to engage suppliers. And this would involve you asking questions of your suppliers about whether they're aware of any modern slavery issues in their supply chains, if they're conducting any social auditing or monitoring of their supply chains, how they recruit staff, have they checked their labor providers, whether they're aware of the UK legislation, if they have a whistleblowing policy, or what type of complaints are coming from workers, and whether they've had any training on modern slavery internally. So, part of your due diligence process might be during the onboarding process to ask those questions, in a tendering process, or it might be that you do some research yourself or hire an external body to work with you to, engage suppliers on these issues and really try to, drill down your supply chain as to what is in place at the supplier level. Eventually, that will give you hotspots or areas that you might need to improve on. So you might find that lots of your suppliers don't have any awareness of modern slavery, and you might want to develop some training around that for them. But in any case, if you do want to go down the risk assessment route, you will be thinking about identifying high-risk areas. So the first thing that I would say to you is, if you've mapped your supply chains and you've got a list of all of your suppliers, you could first do a desk review to look at whether your suppliers have been named in any labor or human rights issues or disputes. So just, look at that, do some desk research there. Look, at any risks around the product or the service that you supply, and then thirdly, look at any risk in the areas where you procure those services or those products. So in a desk review, those are the kind of things that we look at when we map out after we've mapped out the supply chain and we have a list of all the suppliers, and then we award the points based on what we have found in those supply chains, and then that allows us to identify which suppliers we're going to risk assess first. So once we've been to the sites, these are the kind of issues that we might come out with. So we will look at hotspots such as there's no trade union representation, or these companies have never had a social audit, nobody's monitoring labor conditions there. Or we might have had a conversation with the managers and they have no awareness of risk or, modern slavery. They might not have any policies and procedures in place for workers, like they might not have any contracts, or they might have no pay slips, or they might have no control on hours. There's no written terms and conditions. So these are some of the different hotspots that you can pick up after you've been to do risk assessments on the sites. And then, this allows us then to really look at where we need to work with our supply chains. The fifth point really is that you then have to think about how you're going to manage those risks. And so one thing is identifying risks or modern slavery risks or labor exploitation risks. The second thing is, what do you do about them? Now, if you're a small business, it might be that you don't actually have much clout when it comes to working with your suppliers further down the line and getting anything done. So what I would say is, collaborate with other bodies and other suppliers, look at multi-stakeholder projects that are out there for your sector. The likelihood is that there will be something on modern slavery being done. I know there's something in the construction industry, in the facilities management industry, in the hotel industry, in the catering industry, in the fresh food industry. There are bodies out there working on this issue. You might want to, as a company, develop a set of standards that you want your own suppliers to adhere to. So you could have a modern slavery policy, or you could have an ethical trade policy. Larger brands and businesses are doing things like joining UN Global Compact, but really a very, very good standard for any company of any size to have is the ETI base code, so the Ethical Trading Initiative base code, which we talked about earlier. Secondly, you might want to map your supply chain for the products and services and labor that you get for your own company. So mapping your supply chain, I would say, is hugely important to be able to really give you a clear picture of where you're the most exposed in terms of risks. We've talked a little bit about collaboration, and then the last thing that you might want to talk about are social audits and training that you're providing to your own staff. So the training provided to your own staff should always be proportionate to the risks that you face as a company. So it should be, modern slavery training or training based on the risks that you've identified amongst your suppliers. And the people that we tend to focus on are procurement teams, HR teams, and technical managers that are sometimes visiting suppliers. Again, when it comes to training, this is something that you should be reporting on. You could also, further down the line, once you've identified the risks with your suppliers, develop an online course or work with the Wilberforce Institute to give access to an online course for your suppliers. So there are courses that are out there where they could, suppliers could at least start to get some transparency around what modern slavery is, but you do need to train people. And then lastly, the transparency in supply chain guidelines ask companies to report on their key performance indicators. Okay, so it's very business-like. It wants key performance indicators so that it can track how you are developing and how you're addressing these risks going forward, and what kind of changes are happening as a result of you working on these issues. So in some of the internal focus KPIs could be like about within your company, whether you've had any modern slavery cases reported or your whistleblowing line has been activated, how many employees have been trained on modern slavery and trafficking, how many issues of labor exploitation or modern slavery you've had reported. Externals focused KPIs could be how many suppliers have got a modern slavery policy, how many incidents of modern slavery have been reported in your supply chain, or how many suppliers you've had risk assessed. So those are the kind of key performance indicators that we think would be useful for any company to have. Nobody is expecting companies to solve modern slavery issues overnight. I think this is supposed to be a work in progress, and it's supposed to be continuous improvement. So that's why the legislation asks you every year to submit a new modern slavery statement and to report using KPIs so that they can track what is happening in your efforts. So globally, if I was going to advise any company on the key issues that they need to put into place to meet the requirements of the Modern Slavery Act, whether they've hit the 36 million or not, first thing that I would say would be map your supply chains. Look at your, the suppliers that you're spending your money on, and organize it in that way. So look at your highest spend at the top all the way down to the bottom. Then you could conduct a desk review to identify the risks of those suppliers. So either the product or the service that they're supplying, and look whether anything's come up in the areas where they're based, or look at whether they've been mentioned by name in any news articles. Thirdly, target the key suppliers with whom you have significant volume so that you've got some leverage to drive change, and then start to engage them on the issues that are important for you as a company as well, and that meet your obligations under the Modern Slavery Act. Fourthly, identify any sector opportunities for collaboration. Like I said, there are collaborative bodies in constructions and building, food, Electronics Watch in the electronics industry. Ethical Trading Initiative has several sector multi-stakeholder groups that work on different issues. And this will help you if you're quite small and you don't have a lot of clout with your suppliers and you don't have a lot of leverage. It will help you to come on board with other companies to work collectively on the issue at hand. And then fifthly, conduct an on-site risk assessment of your suppliers and use those findings to develop your own policies, just fine-tune your processes, fine-tune your procedures so that you're better able to manage, labor exploitation risks going forward. But those are the 5 key steps that I would advise anybody to take to meet their requirements under the Modern Slavery Act. So that's it from us. Thank you very much for joining us today, and we will now take any questions